Well, thank you very much. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. We're now ready to continue with the second panel of this forum on managing the air commons in Maritime Asia, which is part of our ongoing series on the maritime security in the Asia-Pacific region that our President Richard Fontaine introduced at the very beginning of this program. We have another loaded panel full of experts and not enough time to get into the complexity of these issues. I think if there's one takeaway from the first panel is just to show how difficult it is to try to summarize and understand some of the complexities about something we just take for granted in terms of rules for air. And yet this is an extraordinarily complex issue. And we're going to now talk about what we do about rules for the air commons. But there's a lot of overlap. We're going to start with Professor Peter Dutton, Director of the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. Peter's a frequent visitor to our programs. He's got a lot of knowledge, and he needs to use the podium in order to let out some of his energy to talk about these issues. So, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it. I'll try to be quick because I know there's a lot to say here, but the title of my remarks today is No Way to Climb a Ladder. And that's really what I'd like to think about, no way to climb a ladder. There are 3 points I'd like to discuss. One is, if an air defense identification zone, an ADIZ, is a lawful thing, what is the problem with China's ADIZ? The second point I'd like to talk about is, how should we think about a rules-based order versus an order created by coercion? And the third point I'd like to talk about is building stability rather than building mutual trust. Those are the 3 things I'd like to talk about today with the title of No Way to Climb a Ladder. Because, first of all, if we talk about what is an air defense identification zone, we have them. It's not just the United States, by the way, that has them, and it's not just American interpretations of law that establishes them. It is customary law and state practice that supports them. Additionally, and by the way, there are many air defense identification zones around the world. Some have been established and then subsequently disestablished because the purpose of them has receded. For instance, Italy had an air defense identification zone off of its coast during the period of time when there was conflict in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. It no longer has that zone as far as I know. The bottom line is there is a body of state practice that relates to this, and that state practice is focused on 3 points of law that are really quite easy to understand. And they're important to understand. The first point of law has to do that there's only 2 types of airspace. Unlike sea space, there are only 2 types of airspace: sovereign national airspace and fully international airspace. Full stop. That's it. There are only 2 kinds. That's the first rule. First part of the law you need to understand. The second is that anyone operating in international airspace must operate with due regard for others who are operating in international airspace. In other words, stay out of each other's way. You can go out and you can intercept, but stay out of each other's way. And don't do anything that would harm the other person operating in that airspace. And then the third is there's only 2 ways in which you can use force. Self-defense, unit self-defense, individual self-defense. That is, if I'm operating and I am being attacked myself. The second is national self-defense. Right? So those are the 3 basic laws we have to think about that frame the concept of an air defense identification zone off a coastal state's coastline. So air defense identification zones exist in state practice around the world, not just in the United States. And so China has a legitimate right to establish an air defense identification zone. Michael Swain was right about that point. Right? But there is, in fact, a body of law that relates to what can be done and what cannot be done, and state practice that supports it. And Commander Odom was exactly correct. China has exceeded in many ways those basic rules that I just set out in what it claims the right to do in its air defense identification zone. And that's why American officials, I think, I'm not here to speak for them, but that's why American officials, I think, claim the air defense identification zone is illegal. Not that air defense identification zones are illegal, but that this particular zone is illegally established. That's the point. Okay? So if an air defense identification zone is lawful, what's the problem with it? Problem number one is that China's air defense identification zone overreaches in its claims of right to regulate the behavior of others in fundamentally international airspace. That's problem one. Problem two is that it is an affront to Japanese responsibilities, sovereign responsibilities, to administer the Senkaku Islands. It's an affront to that sovereignty. Now let me take us out of this particular example and for a minute think about another example. There is another territorial dispute in the world that I'd like to use, and that is the status of East Jerusalem. The Palestinians claim that it is Palestinian, and the Israelis claim that it is Israelis, and the Israelis occupy it, administer it, and control it. But the Palestinians claim it as the Palestinian capital. What would the international community think if today the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian government, claimed we're going to regulate the air traffic over East Jerusalem, we're going to claim the right to undertake emergency measures, and you have to check in with us anytime you fly over that airspace? What would we think about that as an international community? We would be appalled, frankly, right, at that provocative, unilateral act to change a certain status quo rather than an act of negotiation over that territory, but an act of unilaterally changing the status quo in regard to that. So I'm, frankly, quite sympathetic to the Japanese on this particular point. Second point, well, how should we think about a rules-based order versus an order created by coercion? I'd like to quote a speech given by the Japanese Consul General in Boston about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, at the Harvard Project for Asia and International Relations. He said a couple of things that I found thought-provoking. One was, he said, "It is now a fundamental tenet of international order that the status quo cannot be made to change by use of force." He went on to elaborate that Japan learned this as part of the lessons of World War II, right? And that Japan has, in fact, taken on this and internalized this value in the way it's behaved. And he went on to note the irony, frankly, that China insists that Japan behaved by the order of World War II, and yet China's behavior appears to be much more, well, I will say China's behavior is coercive in terms of changing the status quo in the near seas. So the Consul General then went on to say, Japan is one of just a few countries that have accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. I don't think that point is well appreciated, because what does that mean? First of all, that means that Japan has open jurisdiction at the International Court of Justice. It has not limited the right of any country to bring a claim of any kind against it in international court. China has an avenue, a non-coercive avenue, to approach this dispute in the international arena, and that is the International Court of Justice. Japan has not limited jurisdiction. It is one of a very few countries that have not limited jurisdiction. In other words, Japan has taken a mature approach to dispute resolution, one that allows for opportunities for peaceful dispute resolution rather than coercive dispute resolution. He also went on to say that, however, to be an idealist, it is necessary also to be a realist, and that's reinforcing the US-Japan alliance. And I just want to make a point here about irony, since I'm talking about it, which is that Chinese behavior is, in fact, coercive in the near seas. I think we've heard quite a bit about that already. And it causes all of its neighbors concern about what China's growing power means in the region. Right? So the irony here is that just as China seems to be attempting to expand its influence and control in the region as it believes its stature is entitled to, right, it is causing a reaction against it, a balancing, frankly, reaction against it that I don't think it intends to do. Oriano Mastro in the previous panel pointed out that very often China has a tin ear about the effects of its actions, and here's an example, I think, where we're seeing that play out. The third point I wanted to make, and the final point, is that we need to stop talking anymore, frankly, about mutual trust with the Chinese. I think that's a very important point. Because the Chinese have established this lexicon in great power relations that we need to build mutual trust. And that's, frankly, it's a good thing. I'm not disputing that. It is an important and a good thing. But it's the wrong lexicon. We're kicking the soccer ball on the wrong pitch when we're talking about a mutual trust, right? Because we are a long way from mutual trust. And so what I want to say is that we need to forget mutual trust, and we need to start thinking about what it means to build stability and predictability, right? This is where I come back to the point of ladder. The point of the ladder is the first rung of the ladder toward mutual trust is stability and predictability, right? The international behaviors that regulate a sort of predictability where we begin to understand each other, and we know we can have some confidence that we will work our problems out through international institutional approaches rather than coercive approaches. Right, so the title of this panel has to do with unilateralism, and I come back to this point that often countries take actions that they perceive to be fully legitimate, but that are perceived by the other side as being vertically escalatory in the relationship. Right? I believe the Air Defense Identification Zone was one such action. I will, by all means, also say that there are other actions that the Japanese should stop considering, they should consider stop taking, like visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. These are unilateral actions that cause problems with the other side. Right? So if you really want to climb that ladder towards mutual trust, you have to first start with stability, then build from stability into predictability. From predictability, you can build your way up towards mutual trust. But when you undertake unilateral actions that either miscalculate the reaction by the other side or that undermine the predictability and stability of the region, you have no rungs to climb towards mutual trust. So the title of my talk today is No Rungs to Climb, or no way to climb the ladder, really. No way to climb the ladder. Because these unilateral acts are destabilizing rather than stabilizing. They result in unpredictability rather than predictability. And there's no way to climb that ladder towards mutual trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Dutton does such a great job of trying to make international law understandable, and he's certainly helped. I'm sure it'll be now more confused as we go through the rest of this panel, but it's a delight to turn to Kunimiyake, who's flown in from Japan, to kind of give you a larger perspective about how this is viewed from Japan.
Thank you, Patrick. You will regret that you invited me in 20 minutes or 10 minutes. There's no consensus, on this. In this room about a lot of things. And first of all, I came here, before coming here, I thought that it was going to be pronounced Addis. Then I came here and people say Addis or Addis or AIDS-Z or whatever. So I'm very much confused. But the essence is not the pronunciation. And of course, the essence is not the legality or legitimacy of the zone itself. I think the bottom line, the essence is the possibility of changing the status quo by force, not only in our part of the world, but all over the world. The crisis in Ukraine clearly represented that. See, there, if you have power, there's a possibility that they can change. And the Russians proved that. So this is the timing we are discussing this issue. I just want to touch upon a little bit about Crimea. Oh, by the way, we pronounce it Crimea. So I don't know which one is correct. So the example of Crimea is a reminder. And not only that people can change the status quo, but also the assumption based on with respect to the rebalancing, or pivoting is changing. You see, the old assumption is this: Europe is safe, and we are ending the wars in the Middle East, so let's get down to business in Asia. But Europe is not peace anymore, and it will have a ramification, or at least impact, in the Middle East and East Asia as well. So this is a situation we are in. So it's not only the legality of the zone, but we have to look at this issue from the strategic or geopolitical perspective. Peter was kind enough to represent the Japanese government, so I don't have to say anything else. But let me represent myself. And what I think is necessary is the following. First of all, for Japan, we have to have the capability to defend ourselves. It's not militarization, by the way. Don't use the word militarization. That's not the issue. The issue is whether we can improve our ability to defend ourselves, especially in the southern remote islands. And the second is, of course, the reinforcement of, enhancement of the Japan-US Security Treaty or Alliance arrangement, including the new guidelines to be discussed in the future. But these are not alone. I think the most important thing is the multilateralization of this issue. See, this is not a bilateral issue between Japan and China. This is not only between US and China. This is an issue between China on one hand and all the neighbors in our neighborhood. As our Vietnamese friend, or Vietnamese American friend, excuse me, stated, this is not only the East China Sea, but also South China Sea issue. So I think we have to have a multilateral framework to come up with a new set of rules to avoid any kind of confrontation or showdown or friction or whatever. I think we shouldn't be naive to believe that we can have peace. We should avoid confrontation and military engagement. That's probably something we should pursue at this moment. And another bottom line I have to tell you is the real serious issue. The real bottom line is whether the United States wants and will continue to be a Pacific power in this part of the world. You see, crisis in Ukraine and chaos in the Middle East, can we, or can you, continue to be a Pacific power? This is the bottom line. And of course, it depends on China to a certain extent. I don't want to talk about a specific country, but since Dr. Mastro raised the issue of what China wants to do, I think nobody knows that, as she said. Even the Chinese people don't know. But that is not the issue. You know, we can question their intentions, but we have, if we want to come up with a policy, we have to have some kind of assumption. So what we need is a strategic forecast or geopolitical forecast. And unfortunately, my assumption is, my forecast is that China seems to be making the same kind of mistake Japan had made in the 1930s by taking advantage of the very nationalistic popular sentiment. The government, and especially the military, challenges the United States, and especially in the challenging its maritime hegemony in the Western Pacific without appropriate control of the armed forces. I think that's exactly what the mistake we made, and I don't want China to repeat the same mistake. And finally, you know, what would happen next? So after Ukraine, the United States will have to make a decision in this part of the world as well. But of course, what they do in Europe is closely related to your policies in this part in the Western Pacific or East Asia. For example, if the United States did nothing in Ukraine and Russia is going to stay, probably that would embolden the armed forces of our neighbor. It's a very serious mistake. That could be a very serious mistake. At the same time, if the United States did it too well in Ukraine, they say, or maybe our neighbors say, oh, maybe Americans are going back to Atlantic, NATO, European sort of formation. So they're leaving Asia. Okay, thank you very much. That could be a conclusion. So we have to, the United States hopefully will have the right policy in Ukraine. And that will have a ramification in our part of the world. And I don't want the current administration in this country to send a wrong signal to our neighbors in East Asia. Thank you very much.
Oops. Thank you so much, Kuni. Of course, my colleague and the Deputy Director of the Asia Program, Eli Ratner, just came back from a Russian dialogue, and of course there was a lot of discussion about Japan, Russia. So it's not just the United States having to think about Ukraine and Russia, but also Japan very much wondering, how do you negotiate territorial issues with a Russia that is in the West, moving in a different direction from the one you want to move in the East? A couple of issues have been raised already by our first two speakers, and before we move into our next two speakers, who both have operational Air Force background and experience, this question of a ladder that Peter Dutton has raised, it's a great metaphor. The question is, who's climbing that ladder, and can you climb it all at the same time? Because there are several actors, as General Onoda pointed out with his charts this morning. We haven't even mentioned Taiwan in the midst of this, and President Ma Ying-jeou has just put on the table a proposal for a code of conduct for the East China Sea that might be more all-inclusive if you could get to that. But the question of air forces rather than commercial air is ultimately one of the concerns here, because without clarity, without common rules, without the stability, the concern that this could escalate. So it's a great pleasure that Colonel Erik Solli from the Royal Norwegian Air Force and a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies over at the National Defense University has been able to join us today, giving us an outside perspective and an expert perspective on these issues. So Colonel Solli, please. You can sit down and do it right there. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation and opportunity to speak at this conference. But first of all, I would like to point out that the views I present here are not representative of the National Defense University. They are my own views, nor of the Department of Defense or U.S. government. But perhaps most importantly, what I'm about to say does not represent the Norwegian military government, for that matter. It's a very sensitive issue for Norway, because as some of you know, when the independent Nobel Peace Prize Committee in Norway in 2010 awarded the Peace Prize to a Chinese citizen, they effectively broke off all political contact between the Norwegian government and the Chinese government, and there's still no contact. So I do not want to add any complications to that issue. So please remember, these are my personal views in any context. The ADSC and air policing intercept is not something unknown to me. It was what I did when I joined the Air Force. I entered service, I was trained as a fighter pilot. I flew F-16s in northern Norway in the mid-80s at the end of the Cold War. At that time, we had up until 600 intercepts and identifications a year. So the volume and intensity was quite high. However, they were conducted operations without any serious incidents at the time that did not cause any problems as far as security policy or relations between states. However, after the Cold War, we have undertaken a lot of other types of operations in the world. But however, in 2010, the Joint Forces Command here in the US, at the very end of its existence, they initiated a study of the global commons. And in that study, all in all, 18 nations and organizations participated. It was the US-led perspective with Canada on board. It was also with 14 European nations, and also NATO Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk. But also the Republic of Korea participated in that study. But they were to look at the domains outside the sovereignty of national state. And they were looking at the air, they were supposed to look at the air domain, and the maritime domain, space, and also the cyber domains. However, when they were going to set up the work packages for that project and assess these topics, they chose not to study the air domain because they thought that it was no problems or no challenge associated with that domain. So the other 3 domains were studied in that project. There's an ongoing follow-up project right now in 2013 and 14 that's led by the Joint Staff J7, where there are now 22 entities participating. Japan is now an observer. We have 2 more European states that are added on, and also the European Union is now participating. But what they're studying is combined operational access. And operational access is a high-end military challenge, for conflict and war. What they're not studying is assured access in peacetime, and they're not studying, of course, the air domain. So it's very, very timely and appropriate that CNAS is, readdressing this subject now in hopefully not only in national community but also international community further on. The problem is that just like some of the critique against the A2AD and also the air-sea battle joint operational concept that are in place and people are working on, they're not addressing the situation at hand, which is what some call the salami tactic of the Chinese in the Asia-Pacific region, and that other strategies needs to be in place. And the same problem here is with the operational access work, is that they're not addressing the assured access to the air commons and in any way. And there are a lot of uncertainties and ambiguities there. First of all, the air defense information zone is not part of any international construct as far as law. It is customary based on practices, and even the term itself is very unknown. I was in Singapore, assigned to an institute there last fall when all this merged in November. And there was a lot of confusion just about the term itself, since it's not legally or properly defined anywhere, except for in national documents. And like this, some panelists have pointed out already, that these national definitions are somewhat different also. The ADC is supposed to reduce risks for incidents, and they're supposed to reduce ambiguity. In the Cold War, we had some problems with that. For instance, back in 1960, we had an incident just outside Norway when the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft was shot down with a crew of 60 persons aboard, even if it was in international airspace. It was 15 miles off the coast of the Kola Peninsula in the Soviet Union. However, due to some misunderstandings, the aircraft was still shot down. So to have a clear defined distinction between national airspace and international airspace, but also where you might be intercepted, is very useful. And the US Air Force actually lost about 75 aircrew in between 1950 and 1960 flying reconnaissance missions where they were shot down due to this ambiguity. And when the air defense zones were set up, identification zones were set up, that actually reduced some of the ambiguity. So if you look from 1916 onwards, the number of military incidents has reduced dramatically. However, the problem has been civilian incidents. So if you go in the 50s, two civilian airlines were shot down, one over Bulgaria, one outside the Hainan Peninsula. Just outside Norway in 1978, the Korean airliner was Boeing 707, misnavigated, entered Soviet airspace, was shot down. Also just north of Japan in 1983, Again, a Korean airliner was shot down by a Soviet fighter due to misidentification, misunderstandings. We also had incidents twice, where P-3s have been hit once by Soviet fighter in 1988 outside Norway, a Norwegian P-3. And also had an incident in 2001 with the US Navy EP-3 that was hit by a J-8 Chinese fighter. Those are not related to any ADSC issues, but basically bad airmanship. But however, we also had two episodes recently where once in 1988 where an Airbus from the Iranian Airlines was shot down by the US Navy vessel. And also in 2001, Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles shot down Siberia Airlines en route from Tel Aviv to Russia. So there are, if you look on history, there are many, many incidents where aircraft have been shot down in peacetime that needs to be dealt with. However, if you look at the Chinese ADSC, it's not a risk-reducing measure. It has some characteristics that increases risk, both politically but also militarily. First of all, how it politically links the ADSC to various maritime disputes adds to the tension. And second, that it overlaps other existing ADSCs, which is unprecedented elsewhere in Europe, United States, or North America. And thirdly, the notion of, or the threat of enforcing in ADSC in international waters, which is also unprecedented in history. However, as some others have pointed out, they're not enforced, that clause in their statement so far, but it's still not retreated in the international community. So my point at the end is that everybody points out there's no Cold War in Asia, but however, it's very important to keep a cool head in the future episode, given all the unintended incidents we had previously in the Cold War, especially. And it's wise for everyone to study history and why those episodes occur and how to avoid similar episodes in the future. Second, it's important to have bilateral agreements. The only time where you can have regimes built so far between navies and between air forces in international waters and international airspace is an arrangement called INCSI, Incidents at Sea Agreement. And that agreement is not applicable only to navies, but also to air forces. But however, they only exist bilaterally between different nations. When I was in Singapore last fall, especially the Chinese resisted any initiatives to establish INCSI agreements in the region. They were stating it's a Cold War construct. But however, Norway and Russia still have an INCSI agreement valid. It was, and also other INCSI agreements that was constructed in the Cold War or the period right afterwards. They're still valid and they still seem useful by all parties. So I would highly recommend that that type of construct bilaterally will be implemented in the Asia-Pacific region. Third, in the long term, there's a need for an international framework. And it's also important to have a dialogue, and that also includes the Chinese. I understand it's not present here in this conference, but that they need to be included in any bilateral, multilateral efforts to try to reduce tensions in the air commons in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Colonel Soley, thank you very much for reminding us of just how dangerous the air can be and how important it is to try to create those rules for stability that Peter Dutton talked about and Kuni Miyake talked about. We have to try to figure out a way to challenge and stop coercive diplomacy, challenges to the status quo. We turn now to Schuyler Forrester to help us come up with a strategy for how do we do this. I've known Schuyler for decades, and he's been thinking about strategy all of those decades, and he's currently the Brent Scowcroft Professor of National Security Studies at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Scott?
Thanks very much, Patrick. And I apologize right off the bat. I hope you can understand me. I'm fighting, since I moved to Colorado, I've only had a couple of colds in the last 4 years, but unfortunately I just got one of those. So I hope you can understand me all right this morning. It is a great pleasure to be here, and when Patrick called, I was flattered to be included in this conversation, particularly amongst the experts which we are listening to this morning, far more expert than I in the details of these issues. A quick disclaimer, I'm neither an employee of the U.S. government or the Air Force Academy nor a contractor with any of the above, so I only have to answer to myself and my wife and my dog. And they wouldn't necessarily agree with me either. There are two narratives. I've got so many notes here, but I'm going to throw them out because there's so many wonderful, important things that have been said. But I'm hearing two narratives. So I want to key off that. One is, this is about the rule of law. We're about protecting the rule of law as a principle in international relations. Yes, the Chinese have a right to assert an air defense interception zone. Clumsy, politically tone deaf. I think there's a lot of that. Not likely they're going to reverse that decision. So it's a reality that we have to figure out what to do. And our argument, and we've heard it this morning, we are in the business of protecting the rule of law. We had a lot to do with writing that law and setting those norms over the last 50 years, 60 years. But it's a global good. But I also heard this morning that there are actually a lot of countries that have air defense zones with which we quarrel in terms of their application. And this is a dumb question on my part. Are we consistent in the way we deal with that? If our allies assert a particular procedure with their ADIZ, do we always comply with it, or do we say, no, that's not the way you should do it? We're going to ignore that requirement, thank you very much. Seems to me, if that's what we do, that's what we're doing with the Chinese. We probably don't fly B-52s in the ADIZs of our allies, but we didn't need that to communicate the message. But that's how you deal with it, and it seems to me to be reasonable. But the answer had to do still with a bilateral relationship with that country and a question of power. And I'm very much taken by Peter's suggestion of going to the International Court of Justice. I heard a rather distinguished Chinese academic make the same suggestion about 2 weeks ago in Colorado Springs. I'll come back to that. This is a second narrative. It's not really about law at all. It's about power. It's about our place in the region. And we've heard about salami slices, fears that it will erode our position in the region. You know, Japan has an air defense intercept zone that pretty clearly, at least implies to me, that it's connected to a claim over certain islands and wanting to assert a political position in the region, and that's their right. But it's not our job as Japan's ally to defend that territorial claim. And I don't think we should encourage Japan on that score. I think we have made the point that it is not for us to arbitrate that. The Japanese have encouraged us to play that role, at least at times. The best way for us to be the best ally we could be with Japan and Republic of Korea and others in the region is to remain the stabilizing presence that we are in the region and increasingly engage the parties in that region. Excuse me. And like Peter, again, this is more about stability and predictability. It's not about trust. We cannot assume that the next 50 years are going to be like the last 50, where we had pretty much unfettered access right up to China's window pane. That's a question of power, not a question of law. We've heard many times today, we have the right to go right on up to the edge of the territorial airspace and all of that. We will assert that right, and we assert it all the time, and well, we should. But we have to accept the reality that as soon as somebody else who doesn't want us to have to, doesn't like us to do that, wants to try and restrict our ability to do so, we have to understand that's a reality. And it doesn't mean, as the speaker said earlier this morning, it doesn't mean that China wants us out of the region necessarily. I think China is pretty clear on many levels. They understand the stabilizing role that we play in the region. So where does this leave us? Both these narratives can be zero-sum. They can also be positive-sum. It is a matter of legal right. It is a matter of our strategic interest, and it is a matter of the global and regional good that we maintain a uniquely powerful and constructive presence in the region. And I would echo what somebody said the other day, can we please not have any pivots anymore? We cannot afford to ignore any region of the world. But it is no longer a bipolar or a unipolar world. It may not even be multipolar, it's just diffuse. So it seems to me that a particularly important role for the U.S., which hasn't been talked about, so this is really my bottom line, is to be a leader that includes emerging powers in global and regional institutions in which they, like we, blended the rule of law and political power rather than put them at odds with each other. It's appropriate for us to remind the Chinese that if they want to be a global power, they have to act like one, and that there are ways to do it and ways not to do it. We can encourage multilateral conversations on jurisdictional issues like islands of all sorts, in which we don't actually have a stake in the game as to who owns that rock. It's that those who claim it don't go to war over it. I love the issue of incidents at sea, of figuring out what do you do when you have conflicting ADISs over which there is no body of law? Maybe you do what we've always done with body of law, is sit down and make it. And third, and I say this as an old Cold War arms control guy, there is a role for confidence-building measures, for regular consultation and discussion that isn't confined to alliance lines, on information exchange, on just intentionality, the ability to confront, to call to question, and to address some of these security issues. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is a little different form of leadership. Not to say instead of being the defiant tough guy in terms of the rule of law, we have to be that, but we have to do it consistently. And then our better bet is not to fall back into a zero-sum game as we are in the 100th anniversary of 1914, but find a better way to lead the world for the next 50 years. Thank you.
Forrester, Skye, thank you very much for those comments. We now turn to three discussants who are going to be slightly briefer, and I'm going to start with Sheila Smith, Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Sheila, we've heard time and again that this is largely driven by a Japan-China dynamic that's at the height of the concern, or at least at the center of much of the concern, and yet that necessarily involves the U.S.-Japan alliance. Both of those issues are issues you've studied your whole life, so please.
Thank you. Not my whole life, but
okay,
close to it.
Well,
but thank you, Patrick. I am delighted to be here. Thank you to CNAS and for you to include me in this conversation. I think we should all thank China, frankly, for the announcement of the ADIZ, because I think without it, we wouldn't be here, trying to gain some both conceptual clarity, but also some alliance understanding as well. So I too, like Dr. Forster, I've thrown away my notes for this morning since I've listened to the first panel and then to this previous speakers. Unlike Dr. Forster, I doubt that I can do it quite so eloquent justice, but let me give it a try. I've been sitting and listening. I'm neither a war planner nor a war fighter, right? I come at this as from the perspective of the alliance, U.S.-Japan alliance, and from looking at the region specifically and the dynamics there. So I'm going to share with you some of the blurring of the lines that I've heard as we've tried to get some conceptual clarity and hear from different perspectives. One of the things, a number of us who participated today also participated in a conference up at MIT that Dick Samuels and Taylor Favell ran a week or so ago. And we all had to grapple. I particularly was asked to talk about the air domain, which I have no claimed expertise. But it was very interesting in that discussion and today too to hear the maritime and air domains become so much more, in my mind, interlinked than I had imagined in the past, right? So whether you're an operator or a conceptual thinker or a strategist, you can't, I think, put boundaries anymore on what is maritime, what is air. Or what is cyber, what is space. I think we're looking at a world, especially in the military domain, but in civilian as well, in which these lines are incredibly blurry and getting blurrier, right? So that's one piece. The other piece I thought was really fascinating, it started in this morning and it continues, I think, in this panel, is the civilian-military blurriness, right? We have, and I think General Onoda gave us a nice, beautiful chart of the ADIZ and the FIRs, right, which is really civilian airspace. But we are, in fact, talking about a blurring. And I think maybe, I don't know if Oriana is still here, but I differ slightly from her in that I do think the economic domain, right, the civilian domain of interactions is equally important as our strategic domain, and they have to operate better together as we think about them. Rights, and I think Dr. Forrester mentioned this quite nicely, rights, China's assertion of rights also comes with obligations. You can't have one side of the frame when you're talking about new behaviors. The last piece I think that's very blurry, and I think we'll all continue to be blurry about it, is what is the status quo and what is a legitimate transformation given the rise of China, right, or other regional powers in other parts of the globe. I don't think we could ever assume that what's going on militarily or economically is static. There is no identifiable status quo, even when you don't have the tremendous transformation that we see today in the growth and the rise of China, right? I just don't think global politics work that way. Let me talk a little bit about negotiating frameworks, and again, just to highlight what previous speakers have said. We have UNCLOS. We have a very successful international legal framework, multilaterally negotiated, to talk about maritime rights and to redefine the EEZ, right, maritime space. UNCLOS continues to be a work in progress, and I think the Philippine claim, I think our colleague from Vietnam mentioned this earlier, the Philippine claim on that is a particularly important piece of the puzzle as we go forward. UNCLOS will live and breathe and change as well. I personally think the United States better get in there quicker. The second we talk an awful lot, especially in ADIZ and the military side of things, is risk reduction, all of which our previous speakers have talked to as bilaterally negotiated. Whether it's in the Cold War or even in this post-Cold War, lots of countries negotiate risk reduction and then don't need to do it again. I thought the Italian-Yugoslavian example really helpful in reminding us that these things can go away. Risk can also go away. But when you have risk rising, which is what we have in the East China Sea, right, we need to address risk reduction better. General Lee said trilaterally would be good. That's great. Quadrilaterally, also great. But I think at least bilaterally, the Japan-China, that piece of the Japan-China puzzle, I think for me, is most alarming. The lack of the willingness of Beijing, frankly, to address the need for risk reduction mechanisms, or at least a dialogue, I think is troubling as we read Chinese intentions. Let me try very quickly in the last couple of minutes, Patrick, if you're tolerant, to talk a little bit about the US-Japan alliance. Again, we talk about country-specific readings of China. We talk about how we strategically, independently are trying to respond to what we think are Chinese capabilities and Chinese intentions. But I think we ought to focus also on an alliance, the US-Japan piece in particular. And I will put out for discussion here the idea that today Tokyo and Washington have a new challenge. And that is, this is the first time in the history, 60-some years, almost 70 years of this alliance, that we really have to think of a contingency in which Japan may be involved inadvertently or through miscalculation in a use of force incident before the United States. So for the Cold War and even the decade after, it was largely a contingency elsewhere. It was on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps Taiwan Straits, but it was not sitting there right in Japanese soil and contested Japanese sovereignty. We now have an American policymaking process that has to think very carefully about the terms, conditions, and ways in which we respond should Japan become involved in a use of force incident. And that can be a senkaku scenario, a gray zone scenario, if you like that terminology, or it can be bigger than that. Japan and China today have an incredible stream of areas and places where their militaries are interacting much, much more regularly and without risk reduction mechanisms to build in stability. So the alliance is changing. Our alliance needs to keep up with the realities, and I don't mean that we have to be aggressive about it. I think there's other domains in which we ought to be coordinating in our policies, but at the very least, I think our guidelines conversation this year and going forward will have to talk about alliance contingency planning, alliance risk management, and alliance scenario building in terms of the way our senior political leaders, as well as our military commanders, understand the parameters of when, where, and how the United States and Japan will operate together. We don't want to have ambiguity in that part of our alliance relationship with Japan. Now, I have a lot of conversations that I have here in Washington. I have people come to me and say, but we are going to embolden the Japanese. And for all of us who have worked on the U.S.-Japan alliance or have looked at Japanese security planning for the last several decades at least, if not a lifetime, emboldening Japan is hard to do. Our policymakers have tried repeatedly to embolden Japan in the security sphere. But we should be aware of the fact that the Japanese public, as well as Japan's political leaders today, see the security challenge of China differently. And they see it differently largely because of Chinese behavior in the East China Sea. And we ought to understand that and think about collectively how to influence those kinds of characteristics of our decision making. Thank you so much.
That was very elegant indeed, Dr. Smith. Sheila, thank you so much. And we heard this morning from our other Korean ally, General Jin-Hak Lee, and we turn now to Dr. Lee, Sang-Soo Lee of the Korean National Defense University, who's currently visiting Florida State University, my big rival when I was an undergraduate at the University of Florida. But I'm delighted to see him here as an old friend. And we haven't heard one country mentioned this morning, that's North Korea. And I don't know, Dr. Lee, whether you're willing to countenance this question in your discussion points, but if North Korea declared over the northern limit line an ADIZ that overlapped, how would South Korea respond to that? But anyway, please, your remarks.
A little bit deviating my focus, but I'm going to present my prepared material. Thank you for having me this fascinating conference. I'm very thrilled to see prestigious experts and distinguished audience on the security affairs. Let me begin by discussion by reviewing the concept of Chinese dream. It has been suggested by Chinese President Xi Jinping. China's recent announcement of its AD zone in East Asia Sea is very closely connected with the concept of Chinese dream. Basically, the principle of Chinese defense policies are maintaining and expanding China's core national interest. China's vital interest cannot be negotiated with other issues. In order to defend and realize these core national interests, China is flexing its muscle nowadays with gunboat diplomacy against its weaker maritime neighbors like Vietnam. Let me briefly elaborate on China's three vital national interests. First, preserving China's socialist system and national security. Second, safeguarding China's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Third, pursuit of stable economic development. China's objective of territorial integrity include Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea, East China Sea, and Yellow Sea. And this three area was recently included, South China Sea, East China Sea, and Yellow Sea. Nowadays, in China's policy-making process, hardliners are gaining power. Maybe there is a reason behind that domestic purpose, but there will be many other reasons realizing Chinese dream, maybe. Xi Jinping tends to be a nationalistic hardliner, judging by his political behaviors. China's recent unilateral attempt to change the rule-based status quo can be interpreted as the same context. The U.S. has been rule maker so far, but China is challenging the U.S. rules against its increased economic and military power. China attempts to emerge as a new rule maker in Asia-Pacific area. China may proclaim another ADs in South China Sea if its ADs rule on East China Sea is consolidated. China's expansion of its ADs is a reflection of the U.S. air-sea battle military posture. Right now, the posture is slightly defensive, but the Chinese military strategy is becoming, offensive mode. China's unilateral assertiveness to change rule-based Asia-Pacific air command can be based on its military competence. With the enhanced economic and military influence, China may try to break through the U.S. potential containment line. China has acquired many naval logistic ports in Indian Ocean, just as Kwadar in Pakistan, Chittagong in Bangladesh, Gakpyu in Myanmar, etc. China tried to expand its string of pearls by participating in port development projects in Indian Ocean littorals. China has secured its potential logistic naval port in Fiji in order to access to West Pacific area, which is further reaching to the Hawaii. In conclusion, it is high time to expand the strategic dialogue between U.S. and China on military affairs. At the moment, the U.S. and China hold a strategic dialogue in economic fields on a regular basis, but it needs to map out military competence building between the two countries in order to prevent unexpected military clash and secure a safe international air commerce. The U.S. and China's successful competence building may be instrumental in coping with North Korea's contingency situation. In the process of trust-building measures, the U.S. may have to accept some of China's demand of a new type of relationship between the two countries. The U.S. is going to be an indispensable state in the process of conflict management between China and the relevant ASEAN weaker states. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Lee, thank you very much, and thank you for the reminder again that when an issue like an ADIZ is announced in the context of the rule of law, it's not necessarily perceived as an act of the rule of law, it's perceived as an act of a military strategy that's being implemented. And the perception of the ADIZ and the other actions that are being taken in this region by all the actors is driving up tensions and is leading toward the greater likelihood there will be indeed the kind of incidents that Colonel Soley and others have pointed out. It's a pleasure now to turn to my brilliant colleague, Dr. Eli Rattler. He may be last, but Eli, the good news is that whatever you say is also sort of the last word that people remember, so it has to be right. Please.
Great. Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks to all the presenters today. And I'll be brief so we can leave some time for questions. Let me just put on the table, having listened to a very interesting conversation today, 3 questions for U.S. policy and strategy going forward as it relates to this issue. The first would be how the United States and Japan in the region, but thinking from the U.S. perspective, balance the tension between the desire for stability versus the desire to deter and reject unilateral acts of revisionism. Put another way, how do you balance efforts to build a rules-based order that most of the panelists talked about versus the tension that doing so can actually legitimize and regulate some of this coercive behavior? As my colleague Bridge Colby and I have written, an overemphasis on stability can actually run the risk of creating a permissive environment for unilateralism. And we have seen a troubling pattern of Chinese behavior of rocking the boat, relying on the United States to right it, and incrementally making gains in sovereignty claims in the process. And so paradoxically, reducing risk under certain circumstances can be bad for long-term stability. So in a very practical sense, when we think about the ADIZ and the East China Sea, how do we think about things like confidence-building measures, hotlines, crisis management, military-to-military engagement on this issue if engaging in those risk reduction measures runs the risk of validating Chinese assertiveness and Chinese ADIZ? That's the first point. The second question, I guess, to build on Sheila's comment about some of the blurriness, I guess the question would be, what's perhaps not blurry about the air commons or the air domain as a distinct feature? I think this is very much a question. I don't necessarily have a position on this. But is the air domain unique in terms of the consequences of an accident or incident? Is it unique in terms of the military missions being performed? Is it unique in terms of the proliferation of unmanned systems? And from a policy perspective, should the U.S. approach to contestation in the air domain in Asia be qualitatively different than how we deal, for instance, at sea, or should we have a singular conceptual response to these types of behaviors? The third question I would ask that I think, again, has been raised, but I'll just underscore it. is how the United States and the region should approach the prospect of a Chinese ADIZ in the South China Sea. And I think this is an important issue. I think many experts believe the question of a Chinese ADIZ in the South China Sea is a question of when, if not if. But the genie is still in the bottle in that case. We've talked today about, well, the ADIZ in the East China Sea has happened. We're not going to be able to reverse it. In the case of the South China Sea, it hasn't happened yet. And so we have at least an opportunity to think about what the appropriate approach to the prospect of that is. I guess, again, I think it's a very interesting question. And there are pretty different approaches to this. What we've seen, it seems, from the administration over the last month or so has actually been an effort to deter China from announcing an ADIZ in the South China Sea. We've seen this through congressional testimony. We've seen it through media statements that suggest the United States will respond, for instance, by enhancing its military presence in Southeast Asia if China were to do so. But there's a sort of a parallel and contradictory refrain from experts and from the administration that says, of course China has the right to an air defense identification zone. The problem in the East China Sea was that it was an overextension and that it was diplomatically ham-handed, not that it was announced in and of itself. So somewhat related to the first question I asked, but I think there is a question on the table, a very real question on the table right now for the United States and the region, perhaps in the context of ASEAN and ASEAN-centered institutions, around whether the appropriate approach right now is to negotiate and try to institutionalize ADIZs in the South China Sea that brings China into that tent, or whether the policy right now should be to prevent, deter a Chinese ADIZ in the South China Sea and to reject it if it occurs. So I would just leave those on the table as three policy questions we're facing going forward.
Eli, excellent points. I wonder if I can just pick up on the third one and turn maybe just back to Peter and Kunimiyake to get a quick response about if China declared an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea. First of all, what would the United States do, and would U.S. declaratory posture that's already said, don't do this, China, what role is that playing, do you think, in China's calculus? I know it's very difficult questions, and Peter Dutton, you don't have to answer that exactly the way I phrased it. Yeah. But come at that issue from the U.S. perspective, and Kunimiyake, if you would come at the perspective of what could Japan do to help ASEAN and Southeast Asia? You yourself underscored the very real point that there is a strong connection, really, between what's going on in the South and the East China Seas. But as a practical matter, what else could Japan do to support actions if China went ahead at some point in the coming months with an ADIZ? Others on the panel can jump in if they really want a two-fingered. I just want to leave time for questions from the audience as well. So Peter Dutton first.
All right, so one of the things that I'm going to suggest is that we actually think about the three big rules that I mentioned. That, in other words, an air defense identification zone actually does not do anything special for a coastal state. Right? It does, someone brought it up, I think it was you, sir, who brought it up, that it's helpful to put the international community on notice that they might be intercepted in that space, but it doesn't actually give the coastal state any additional authority to intercept in that space. So one of the things that I think China could do is it can begin exercising its existing rights in international airspace. So that, in fact, in some ways would be a step forward in that China would recognize it as international airspace, right, and then begin abiding by the rules, and then we would all just have to get used to additional locations where aircraft might be intercepted, and as long as due regard was observed, it's something that we could all learn to accept and to live with. The declaration of an ADIZ itself would be a problematic thing in the South China Sea because there's so much airspace that is, well, let's just say it's not Chinese. I'm not sure whose it is, but it's not Chinese, yes. Right? Because the islands are occupied by others, and there's multiple overlapping claims, and so this, how many of your neighbors do you really want to make hopping mad? Right? Is the issue?
Indeed. Kunimiyake.
Thank you. If they declared another ADs or whatever in the South China Sea, of course the U.S. will say no, stop it, abrogated or whatever, then they won't listen. Because the ADs in East China Sea is not only focused on Senkaku, but I think it is water areas and control of water areas and airspace inside the first island chain. I think this is their objective. So therefore, if it happens, they're not going to change. So we will go to the process of multilateral rulemaking, including China, and negotiations on the code of conduct or whatever, what we've been discussing for the sea. Now we may have to have another round for the air. But then they will not comply. They will not agree to whatever. So I think in the end, we're going to end up with the confidence building measures, some kind of, so that we should have a minimum level of understanding. And what if we do this, it should be interpreted in this way, and if we don't do this, it should be interpreted that way. There should be a minimum level of understanding as they had between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War era. Thank you.
I'm going to keep going down this line. I know, Scholar, you want to come in on this point. I wonder, Colonel Sala, I'm going to come back to you right after this, and to Sheila Smith at least, just come back and say, to your predicament that you, again, highlighted, Sheila, which is that the Chinese are unwilling to deal with the Japanese on the risk reduction. So they repeatedly are trying, and they're being stiff-armed, directly denied meetings. Even the counterpart to Director General Tokuchi has been told, no, we don't deal with Japan. I mean, so they're even denying the possibility of talking about the hotline that they were actually broaching last April. So what do you, and Colonel Sully, so what do you do if a country won't engage in an INC type of discussion? Do you have any ideas on that? But Dr. Forrester, please, come on in on this issue.
Well, before we change this up, I just want one word of caution. Maybe that's not the way it is in this town, but I live 2,000 miles away. It looks a lot like there is this notion that one negotiates and engages, uses arms control or those kinds of things, that's only from a position of weakness. And actually, negotiations have always been more effective when you feel you have a vulnerability that takes you to the table, but you also have a sense of strength going to those negotiations. So you got to have those two things together. I'm a little leery of saying we're going to deter them. Oh, if that doesn't work, then we'll negotiate. Because if the deterrence fails, then it's pretty clear why you're now negotiating. And we often try the coercive measure or the deterrent mode. And when that doesn't work, we feel ourselves in a weaker position and then don't want to engage in something different. And we subject ourselves to a political critique because we appear weak, at least in the eyes of some people on the other side of the aisle. So I'm a little leery of the deterrent strategy.
Thank you for that. Sheila?
Just on your point, Patrick, about the Chinese behavior towards the Japanese of late, right? China is basically creating, I think, the incentive inside Japan to pursue greater military strength. I mean, I think that's just pretty obvious, and I think it's pretty rational on the part of Tokyo. In the China-Japan relationship since 1978 has largely been built on diplomatic management, for example, of the island dispute, diplomatic management of the kind of difficulties of economic interdependence, diplomatic management to a large extent, limited extent on the military side. China has for some reason decided we don't need to deal with the Japanese, we're going to deal with Washington, right? So two things for Washington policy planners, which gets a little bit to one of Eli's questions, is I don't think we do either or defense deterrence and discussion. I think we do both. Because we can't, A, have an alliance that doesn't work. B, we have to shape the alliance towards the new scenario and situation in Japan's defense concerns, not necessarily emboldening, but making sure that those defense concerns are adequately met. And we have to lead, I think, on confidence building, on risk reduction. And frankly, we have the experience in the Cold War. The INCSEs, the kinds of things that we're all talking about today come out of the experience of the Cold War. They may not be necessary everywhere around the globe anymore, but they are experiences that the United States and their allies Japan included, by the way, with Russia, right, has a long-term viable conversation about the air domain with Russia, right? So these kinds of experiences, I think, can be translated into the East China Sea. But I completely agree. This is not an either or, nor if this doesn't work, then this. We got to go at it all together. And Japan, China will have to go at it their own way. We will go at it regionally in the way that I've described.
So, Colonel Solly, during the Cold War, were European allies covered under the INCSE and the Dangerous Military Incidents Agreements, or did they have their own bilateral discussions? And did the Soviet Union abide by all of these with these countries? I mean, I'm thinking about Japan now, not able to discuss this with China, but the U.S. and China are moving a bit toward at least discussing incidents at sea and avoidance of dangerous military incidents.
Yes, in the Cold War, the U.S. Navy they agreed on an INCSE agreement with the Soviet counterparts in 1972, and afterwards, several Europeans followed on and had established bilateral agreements with the Soviet Union and also Japan. But when the Cold War ended, Russia adhered to the same regime, and also with the United States and also with European countries. And it's still alive because there's no other international provisions in airspace, for instance, regarding the relationship between military and military aircraft when they meet in international airspace. There are some provisions in ICAO, the regime for aviation, on how to regulate interaction between military state aircraft and civilian aircraft. But there's no rules or norm standards on how in military aircraft, when they meet in international airspace, shall behave and conduct themselves. So I think that's why if there's a resistance of establishing an INCSE agreement in China, call it something else. I think it's very important to establish a mill-mill relationship between aviation communities in Asia and also with the U.S. aviation community and Chinese aviation community, where we can both discuss how to conduct these matters and also how to avoid unnecessary episodes that will lead to even more complex situation than it already is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Eli, did you want to respond to that point, or should we just go to the audience?
Let's go to the audience.
Anybody's hand, question, comment from the audience? Yes, sir, and if you can just wait for a microphone and introduce yourself briefly.
I am Ian Reinhardt with the Congressional Research Service. This year, the Japanese think tank NIDS, N-I-D-S, studied Chinese approaches to crisis management. And one thing that struck me from that study, which is probably familiar to China experts, of which I am not one, is that the Chinese approach toward crisis is a little more neutral, whereas U.S. might see it as kind of inherently negative. We need to create stability and avoid problems. Chinese see it as both an opportunity and a risk. So their conclusion is that the Chinese are unlikely to really throw themselves into some kind of crisis management mechanism because they see opportunity for gains in each of these situations. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of Chinese strategic culture and how their approach to crisis management conflicts with the US or Japanese idea of automatically de-escalating.
Thank you for that. Yes, and we are familiar with the National Institute for Defense Studies study on Chinese crisis management, looking at a fairly limited body of empirical evidence, but nonetheless picking up on the point that was made this morning, which is that sometimes the Chinese find it convenient to introduce risk as a matter of policy rather than avoid risk, which may be, this goes back to what Eli Ratner is talking about. If you just emphasize your search for stability, what are you legitimizing? What are you neglecting? And that's why trying to balance these things going on. Peter, you've got thoughts on this, I'm sure.
I do, yeah. There's a couple things to point out, which is I think the Chinese approach to risk is actually, there are some differences, but I also think they can be exaggerated. Because I think one of the things we have to realize is risk acceptance is related to objective, right? If you think about it, American objectives and frankly Japanese objectives are fundamentally defensive in nature, meaning maintain stability, deter action, the sort of, you don't want anything to happen that could disturb the current status quo. The Chinese, on the other hand, have the opposite objective, right, which is to change the status quo. So some risk has to be accepted in order to do that. And I think we actually see some circumstances in which Chinese are quite risk averse. In other words, the Chinese are willing to escalate to a certain degree, but to avoid military escalation. The Chinese are willing to irritate their neighbors, but I think are really working very hard to maintain a stable relationship with the United States because of the risk disparity that they see in those relationships. So I think we have to first relate risk to objective and understand how that relates to objective, and the Chinese are very efficient in doing that. And the second is to recognize that the Chinese approach to risk may be overstated if we say it's so different from our own.
And I know Colonel Solly wants to come in on this, and Kunimiyake, I would invite you afterward. If you want, well, from a Japanese perspective, I mean, if you're in the Prime Minister's office, for instance, how are you viewing this frustration of not being able to communicate? But the Chinese are communicating privately. They're inviting generals and former generals to Beijing to talk about, is this going to be a risk? Will you escalate? So they're definitely taking the temperature of Japan and the United States in advance. They just don't want you to have a hotline so that you can pick up the phone in the middle of a crisis and say, hey, knock this off, because then they can deny that they knew what was happening and maybe they can get away with something, I think. Or is that not how it's seen in Japan? But Colonel Solly.
Yes, I agree with Professor Dutton that I think the Chinese want to perhaps irritate neighbors, but not anymore, because their first and foremost concern is internal security, not external challenges. And second, it's very important for them to stabilize China by having economic prosperity and economic growth. And I cannot see that they will do anything intentional that will disrupt, their economic trade relationships with both in Asia, with over Europe and United States. And also how that also will disrupt, their economic growth and well-being, and how that contributes to internal security. So, given that first and foremost interest of the regime in Beijing, I cannot see how they will escalate intentionally towards their regional neighbors on these matters.
So there are definitely constraints on what they're doing. There are 45,000 U.S. and Japanese businesses doing work in China. So there's a lot going on between these countries. There's no doubt that they don't want to disrupt some of that, and yet they seem to be taking risks. They don't seem to mind this provocation up to some point. So,
true, but however, there was been trade negotiations, free trade negotiations between China and Japan and the Republic of Korea since last year, and that negotiation process has been uninterrupted by all the events last fall and this winter.
Uninterrupted overall, but they were disrupted momentarily. So let's posit that somebody actually gets killed in the coming months. Nobody's been killed yet between Japan and China. That could change the perception. It may pass, but what if it leads to another incident? What if it ratchets up into the form of nationalism? So that's the concern here. You're absolutely right, Colonel Solly. There are clearly constraints and limits and restraints, and China's trying to assert itself within certain boundaries. And yet, if it escalated, they haven't really put in place the infrastructure to deal with that. And that's one of the common concerns I think most people have outside. Kuni, can you maybe offer a Japanese perspective on this?
I'm not in the Prime Minister's office. I'm not in a government. And I'm not interested in this issue at all. But you asked me to say something, so yes. I have to say something. Hotline, with whom do you talk to in China? That's the question. Even Koreans have hotline, really? To talk to whom? Are you talking about our officers in charge of external affairs, or public affairs? It's no use talking to those guys. You have to talk to the decision makers, and they will never allow you to talk to them directly. So that's the first problem. And the second is, having said that, I think the Chinese, my image or impression, it may be wrong, but they are much better in politics than war. I think they know how to win. At least they think they know how to win without fighting. The Americans love to win by fighting. But Chinese are not like that.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Eli?
In response to the question, I think there is a general sense, actually on both sides, the Chinese side and the Japanese side, maybe a little bit of overconfidence in escalation control. I think it's interesting in the NDPG and other official documents that the Japanese government will say, well, we see the possibility of gray zone contestation, but the likelihood of major war is very low. And I'm not personally clear, having probed this a few times, what the theory of escalation control is between Japan and China. And I think the Chinese also are equally confident in their ability to be able to prod and poke and push, but maintain below a higher level of escalation. So I think the challenge is, certainly on the Chinese side, maybe also on the Japanese side, is how to give both sides a higher, deeper sense of urgency and danger without actually having to create an environment that is so. I think that in some ways, that's what I was suggesting earlier, is that if you always try to be stabilizing and countries don't feel the risk of escalation, as Peter was talking about, it may be that the United States should actually increase the likelihood of souring the U.S.-China relationship or of engagements with the U.S. military, and that building a firewall there isn't stabilizing in the long term. It actually creates an environment for instability. So I think that is this central challenge of how do we deal with an environment where actors may not see the incredible potential for escalation and what to do about that.
Dr. Christopher Young down here would like to ask a question. The microphone is coming.
Chris Young from NDU. Peter, one of the arguments you're making is that we have evidence that the Chinese are being coercive and unwilling to play by the international legal rules, by the fact that they have avenues to go about resolving this peacefully, yet they choose not to. I guess the question, I would turn that on its head a little bit if I were Chinese and ask the question, why don't the Japanese go ahead and force the issue? Why don't they go to the ICJ? And so the question is, why don't the Japanese go to the ICJ? Is that a viable strategy for the Japanese? Secondly, if I were Chinese, I'd ask the question, we're trying to get the Japanese to admit that there's a dispute. We can't get them to do it. So one of the ways we're going to do it is we're going to force the issue by sending forces in to force the Japanese to do that. That's a complication that the United States and Japan needs to work out. So I'd like your commentary on those complications. In other words, it's not as simple as we might think it is. And then the third question, I think Patrick or someone raised the question of Taiwan's initiative to try and resolve this issue through a code of conduct. What's the prospect of that? I think that's sort of an interesting twist to this, that is the Chinese and the Taiwanese have the same exact claims, and yet there may be a way to resolve this legally or through UNCLOS or some way. So the Taiwan aspect of this.
Indeed. And if I can just pile on the Taiwan question, the third part of Chris Young's question, I mean, would it do any good, for instance, if Taiwan and Japan, for instance, started to have discussions, you could bring Korea in as well, to talk, because they've already made progress on fisheries agreement, for instance, and maybe that could provide the incentives for China to say, look, there are ways that you can have these claims and yet still find cooperation and room for cooperation. But anyway, 3 questions. Peter Dutton was sort of given the first chance, but I'll go down the panel as well.
So just quickly about why not have the Japanese initiate the litigation? First of all, as a lawyer, if I think about that, I think, well, my neighbor has a problem with me, why don't I sue him? No, it doesn't work that way, right? So if you have a problem with someone, you have to initiate the legal proceedings. That's just sort of a logical thing. Second, here's the problem, right? I mean, the Japanese are looking at the problem that the Philippines is encountering, right? And realizing that those who initiate litigation against the Chinese simply may end up just making the matter potentially worse, right? So really what I think the right answer is to encourage the Chinese to think about this as a reasonable option. Additionally, one of the things that litigation can do is it can actually provide a framework for negotiations. It doesn't actually have to provide an answer. And if the problem is that we need a better framework for negotiations, let's bring that to an international tribunal, help give us a better framework for how to think about the problem, and then move on through negotiations as China prefers from there. So there really are a lot of good creative approaches to this. And your second question was, why not have the Japanese, why don't the Japanese accept that there's a dispute? I've publicly called for them to do the exact same thing. I mean, it's time to just acknowledge the reality of the circumstance. There is a dispute. Whether one side or the other has the more powerful argument is a whole separate question. But there is clearly a dispute, and it's clearly affecting not just China-Japan relations, but regional relations. Right? And so this is an important thing where let's all just be honest about the circumstances we find ourselves in and move on from there.
Other comments on any one of these three?
International Court of Justice or whatever international tribunal, personally, I think is a good idea. But Japan doesn't have to initiate because we have the territories and we have the administrative controls. Why do we have to go there first? If they want it back, then the other side should go there. And probably, if I were a prime minister, I would accept that because I think we're going to win. Because just 1969 and 1970 official Chinese map clearly shows that Senkaku is our territory. They use Senkaku Chinese characters on their official map. So we're not going to win. We're going to win. So personally, if they go there, I think we should accept the jurisdiction. But secondly, I think your point is not relevant in my view because of course everybody knows there's a dispute. We know that. Everybody knows that because they say that. So it's not admitting or accepting. By saying there's no territorial dispute. It only means we're not gonna negotiate with you on this matter. Period. So we are saying that, in my view, personal view. So it doesn't matter, whether we accept it or not, because they're not gonna make a concession for that at all.
Other comments?
I'd like to change the topic a little bit, going back to the code of conduct question you had. I think that if you set aside the legal part of it, it is a matter of interest and will. Even if in the Cold War, in the 50s and 60s, there were no arrangements or no common behavior because there were no interest and will between the parties in the tensions that were in peacetime to have such arrangements. And that's a similar situation that we are facing right now in the Asia-Pacific region. However, when this changed in the 70s, when we had the various arrangements set forth by the Soviet Union and others, it was based on common interests and a will in both parties to have those arrangements, even if there were still tensions in peacetime between the parties. And my perception is that in Asia-Pacific, they're not there yet, the parties, but perhaps in the future.
Sheila Smith.
Thank you. Just a very quick comment on the ICJ versus recognizing it's a dispute. The fact is, I think from the 1970s and the negotiation of the treaty in 78, the Japanese have recognized that the Chinese have a different point of view and that Taiwan has a different point of view on the sovereignty over those islands. I think we're a little bit getting ourselves twisted up by the word dispute. I don't think there's any definition here, statement that the Japanese can make that will somehow make the problem easier with China. So I think, there's a lot of Chinese commentary about, the Japanese just have to recognize it. But I think the fundamental underpinning of the problem is there is no good negotiation and Japan will not negotiate. Now, the ICJ question largely is interesting for me because lots of other countries that you won't think have gone to third-party mediation in the past have actually gone to third-party mediation because they've made a conscious calculus that they want to put the dispute aside. They want the overall improvement of the relationship, and this is really getting in the way. They can't solve it bilaterally, so let's go to third-party mediation. That's not anywhere near where Beijing and Tokyo are today. So it's not the venue. I think it's the underlying structural tension in the relationship that's the problem. The one thing we haven't talked about in terms of risk, and again, Eli was heading us there, I think, but is the domestic dimension. And we talk a lot about Chinese nationalism, Chinese domestic politics. But again, what I tried to sort of suggest in my comments was there is a domestic risk now for Japanese political leaders of compromise that was not there before. And we all know in democracies, right? You can't manipulate the publics in the same way, I think, that the Chinese may or may not be able to shut protests down or shut their publics down, or we can negotiate, we can discuss that piece of whether that's the right reading of China. But in Japan today, I think the political calculus for any political leader, whichever party you come from, whether you're a nationalist or not a nationalist, the political calculus today is different. And I think whether we call that risk or not, I'm not quite sure, but it is risky for political leaders, both sides now in the Japan-China relationship, to make compromises that a decade ago would have been easy. And I think that's an important piece of the risk puzzle for us to understand.
Right.
Dr. Lee
yeah.
or Dr. Ratner?
Well, I guess my response to this question about the ICJ, in part, I think the Chinese have signaled that they would reject it outright. So the question is, well, why offer it up if it's going to be rejected? But even aside from that, I think there is logic to the argument that the Japanese should not be making concessions under duress, right? And so this is not an appropriate environment. It would not contribute to regional stability to say, well, since the Chinese are engaging in coercive behavior through particularly military means, then that's the environment when you should compromise. So until the Chinese actually stop their coercive behavior on the seas in terms of physically challenging Japanese administration, I don't think it's an appropriate environment, diplomatic environment, to try to negotiate. I guess the other comment I would make is that I think this whole standoff underscores the centrality of the regional institutions, and that really this issue, I think we're probably going to make, if there's progress to be made anywhere, it's going to be through ASEAN and ASEAN-centered institutions, and that's where it's going to be too hard for Japan and China to say no, whereas it's all too easy for them to say no to each other. So I think that should be, as great it would be to try to develop these mechanisms, either the United States taking the lead or between Japan and China, I think it's going to happen through ASEAN.
Good. We have time for one last question. Well, we have two hands, so I'll let you both ask a question. We may not have time to answer it, but Tono-san is a fellow at the Center for New American Security visiting from the Japan Ministry of Defense.
My name is Tomoyuki Ito, a visiting fellow from Japanese MOD. Well, my question is about the possibility of, the situation of conversation, communication between Japan and China. This is my personal view. Personally, I'm thinking that China, in reality, at present, China does not seem to have real intention or motivation to make a deal, seriously negotiate with Japan and make a deal with Japan. And I personally remember from 1981 to 1984, during the first Reagan administration, the Soviets severely, bluntly attacked, criticized, and attacked the Reagan administration and President Reagan himself. But after he was re-elected, they came to the table, and the two great powers proceed in arms control and arms reduction. So then come back to the present East Asia. Last year, Japan has made a significant domestic law for counter-espionage, and that law will be enacted at the end of this year. And this year, the defense guideline will be improved. So not this year, but after 2011, Japan will, in my view, Japan will have a more strengthened, more improved stature. So my question is, do you think that after 2011, the Chinese, will we see a similar change in Chinese behavior for their attitude toward Japan, or their attitude toward the combination of Japan and the US?
You said 2011. Did you mean another date? After when?
After the revised defense guideline.
I see. After the revised defense guidelines, yes. And this gentleman right here would like to make a comment or ask a question.
I'm Marine, I'll just talk loudly. Lieutenant Colonel Dome, I'm a military advisor to the State Department. Very quickly, getting back to unilateral actions, and we talked a bit about what would cause China to declare ADIZ in the South China Sea. And so we heard earlier from the previous panel that the decision in the East China Sea was made at the very highest level. My question is, who is the audience? Is it a counter to U.S. or other countries' actions in the region, or is it for the Chinese people or to prop up the party, the Communist Party?
It's a great question, yes, in terms of the audiences that are intended, and probably multiple audiences we hear shouted out. So this is the final chance to have a concluding statement. We've heard two questions, one of which, if I can highlight one dimension of what Tono-san was saying, is this idea of negotiating from strength. If you can kind of get your policy act together, then you can approach a challenging state and have a better, reasonable prospect. And so maybe with the revised National Defense Program guidelines, the new U.S.-Japan defense guidelines that are coming, does that put Japan and the United States in a stronger position to approach Beijing and say, look, we mean business, you mean business, let's sit down and now talk seriously. And this question about then who indeed is the audience for these Chinese pronouncements and statements and actions, and we're just going to go right back down, but I think I want to start with Dr. Ratner and then come right back down and end with Peter Dutton.
Okay, I'll be very brief, but I think just to the first question, I think it's an open question about how the broader perceptions of U.S. power, Japanese power, U.S. policy elsewhere in the world, whether it relates to Crimea or elsewhere, perceptions of the QDR, sustainability of U.S. defense spending will bear on this set of issues. So I think it is important to keep in mind that there is this broader context, and I think it's an open question about whether Japanese behavior, Chinese behavior, and other partners in the region will or will not be responding to broader perceptions of U.S. power or U.S. decline.
Dr. Lee, would you like to make any final comment? No? Dr. Smith?
Just on the ECS versus the SCS, I have no empirical basis for making this comment, but I'll make it anyway. It would be strange for me, I think, if China decided, okay, I did it in the East China Sea, now let's go do it in the South China Sea, for all the complications I think others here have outlined. But my sense is that once they make the East China Sea more operational, and I think one of the things that I was looking forward to hearing but didn't hear today was really the capability side of things. What can China actually do? And what kind of strengths and weaknesses will it have in the next 5 to 10 years that will give it more operational capacity to perhaps be more forward-leaning? And my sense is East China Sea is where their strategic interests are being challenged by the alliances and by the United States. I think they can manage the South China Sea through fisheries patrols and other kinds of things and don't need to complicate their picture. No empirical basis for that assessment, but that's where I think they're headed.
Dr. Forrester.
Very quickly, I love the last question with respect to reminding ourselves that there are multiple audiences. You didn't hear my answer. My answer to your question was yes, all of the above. And as it is in this country. I mean, you think about the immediate rhetoric of people who didn't know how to spell ADIS, but all had an opinion about how we needed to deal with China on this affront to the status quo. But I think we also need to recognize that within the Chinese side, there's also multiple players. Now, and it was Dr. Swain earlier had mentioned, I don't know that he's still here, had mentioned that this seemed to have come out from the Chinese government, but it's not clear how much it got vetted through the foreign ministry. And I'm thinking back of the launch of a satellite a few years back, which created a lot of debris. And I think the best conventional wisdom on that is that the leadership didn't really understand what was happening, that the military sold them a bill of goods, if you want to put it that way. Oh, don't worry, it won't be a problem. And that they found themselves quite embarrassed by the diplomatic pushback, and we haven't had another similar test. So I don't know that given this pushback and the tensions that came out of this, I don't know that it's inevitable that an ADIS in the South China Sea is, something that we're going to see anytime soon. So I appreciate you reminding us that there are multiple audiences and multiple communicators and decision makers in what even for them is still a pluralistic system.
Colonel Solly.
I think the problem with the ADIS in the Asia-Pacific is their linkage to the maritime domain, not the air domain itself. And because of the contested issues at hand, I'd like to remind you all that I've seen some of the islands that are contested. Some of them are so small they cannot be called islands. Norway and Denmark back in the 1930s had a dispute regarding Greenland, the world's largest island. But we took that issue to court, to third-party resolution, to the International Court of Justice. And Denmark won, Norway lost. It was disappointing for us, but we moved on, and the issue was resolved. And also with Russia and Norway, we had for 40 years, we disagreed regarding the demarcation line between the countries in the Barents Sea. In 2010, we made an agreement with Russia. It was signed by the heads of state, both countries. There were protests both in Russia and Norway, so it was a very good agreement, good compromise. And I think that's what needs to be done in the region. There needs to be a legal or a political resolution, not a military solutions, to put these matters at hand and move on.
Miyake-san.
Yes, let me respond to the intriguing question about the audience and ADs in South China Sea. I think inside the PLA, there have been long discussion and long-term plan to establish those zones in the end. But the question is the timing. And remember, you talk about the leadership or you talk about Chinese people, but don't remember the American vice president. I think that, if my memory is correct, the announcement came just before
Vice
his
President
arrival,
Biden's
Vice President's
visit in China.
visit to China. So I think that's how they treat those pieces of information.
So both questions deal with the relationship between internal and external drivers for China's behavior in the near seas. And I think we should honestly do a whole separate day on that question alone. Okay. But there is something that I do want to, it's an anecdote I'd like to leave you with. I happen to have been in China in 3 different cities in September 2012 as the Senkaku Jiaoyu crisis was spiking. And I was surprised by a couple of things. I was in Dalian, I was in Beijing, and I was in Chengdu. And throughout the country, it dominated, this Senkaku crisis dominated every aspect of the media. And what surprised me about that was I expected Gu Kailai's trial to dominate the media. I expected Wang Lijun's trial to dominate the media. I expected the politics leading up to the October-November leadership transition to dominate the media, and that was nowhere to be heard. None of it was actually in the media at the time. So what I took away from that was that one of the reasons that the Chinese government was perfectly happy to allow this crisis to escalate was that it created domestic political space for them to resolve the party's problems without the expected pressures, because everyone was paying attention to the bright shiny object in the East China Sea rather than to the problems that were going on internally. That is not a particularly comforting thought.
But Peter Dutton, a very important one on which to end this particular forum. It's been a great discussion. I just want to remind everyone that we will, on the 24th of March, as Richard Fontaine indicated, be releasing our Maritime Security Report. We expect to have others to follow, but this one I've authored with Eli Ratner, Elbridge Colby, Alexander Sullivan, and Zach Hosford of CNAS, and we hope it'll at least provide some further food for thought on these issues. On April 2nd, a related issue, we've talked about Taiwan. This is the 35th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, and we'll be conducting a public forum on the future, the next 35 years, if you will, of the Taiwan Relations Act, if there is such a thing. And now, please join me in thanking a tremendous panel. Thank you.